boarded the plane in silence. No name-brand suitcase, no first-class ticket, just a 17-year-old boy in a faded hoodie, walking past rows of indifference until a pregnant woman collapsed 2 seats ahead and no one moved. Not the steward, not the man in the tailored suit beside her, but the boy did. And when the chaos calmed, what he asked broke the man everyone thought had it all. If this story stirs something quiet but deep in you, stay close. And if you'd like, leave a thought, a like, or just subscribe. It means more than you think. The cabin of British Airways Flight 282 hummed softly with the sound of recycled air and the low murmur of elite conversation. First class shimmered under a wash of warm gold lighting, the kind designed to calm nerves and disguise fatigue. Julia Ellington sat in 2A, her belly rising gently beneath a cream-colored cashmere wrap. At 28 weeks, her pregnancy was visible but still graceful. She smiled weakly at the flight attendant who had just delivered chamomile tea, murmured a soft, "Thank you," then reached for her stomach. Her expression shifted, tightened. She coughed once, then again, harder. Her hand clutched her chest. Then her body slid forward in the seat, a sharp sound escaping her lips. The porcelain cup clattered to the floor. In seconds, she was slumped over the armrest, gasping. A man 2 rows behind her stood up. "Is there a doctor on board?" His voice cut through the low chatter. Passengers turned in unison. The atmosphere shifted instantly from indulgent comfort to alarm. The flight attendant dropped her tray and crouched beside Julia. Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her voice trembled under its professional cadence. From the back of the plane, in the last row near the lavatories, Malik Carter felt something press behind his ribcage. It was instinct, not impulse. He stood slowly, scanning the front of the cabin. His hoodie hung loosely from his frame, and the soles of his sneakers squeaked slightly on the carpet as he walked up the aisle. At 17, he knew better than to insert himself where he wasn't wanted, but he'd seen this before, in his grandmother's bedroom, with the same panic, the same gasping for air. "She's not choking," he said, his voice even but clear. "She's not having a panic attack either. If it's a pulmonary embolism, she needs aspirin and oxygen. Now." A businessman in a navy jacket frowned. "You a doctor? Kid, no." Malik met his eyes. "But my grandmother almost died the same way. I recognized the signs. No one moved." Julia's breaths came in short, jagged bursts. Her lips had started to pale. The attendant froze. Someone else reached for the call button again, pressing it like it might summon a miracle. Thomas Ellington stood next to his wife, his hand on her back, eyes wide but guarded. He looked at Malik, then at the attendant. "Do we have aspirin on board? I believe so," she stammered. "Bring it." The flight attendant ran. Thomas turned back to Malik. "What else?" "Oxygen," Malik said. "You need to keep her calm. Keep her upright if you can. Let her breathe deep, slow, but get that aspirin in her." The cabin was silent except for the rattle of the air vents and Julia's uneven breathing. Thomas stared at the boy. 17, maybe. Clothes faded, posture stiff. Not someone he would have noticed in any other situation. But right now, he was the only one who'd said anything that sounded like it made sense. The aspirin arrived. Malik handed the pills to Thomas, who held them out for Julia, coaxing them past her lips. The oxygen mask followed, with another flight attendant fumbling with the canister and straps. Julia took one breath, then another. Then, slowly, her chest began to rise more evenly. There was no applause, only quiet. The kind that fills a space when something frightening has passed, but not fully. Thomas sat back, his hand still resting on Julia's shoulder. He looked at Malik again, longer this time. Not quite gratitude, not quite understanding, but a pause. Malik returned to his seat, still feeling the weight of 100 stares. No one said thank you. No one offered him water or a nod. He slid back into his seat, pulled the hoodie over his head, and looked out the window at the black expanse beyond. But Thomas kept glancing back every few minutes. Just once, Their eyes met again. He didn't look away, but he didn't know yet what he was looking for. Mullet Carter sat back in 41F, legs pulled in, hoodie bunched around his face. The hum of the engine had returned, a low, indifferent sound. Nobody had clapped, nobody had said anything to him, not the man who doubted him, not the woman in heels who had rolled her eyes when he stood up, not even the flight attendant who now avoided eye contact as she passed. But Julia Ellington was breathing easier. That was enough. Or it should have been. He looked down at his hands. They weren't shaking anymore, but his palms were damp. It wasn't the act of stepping forward that rattled him. It was what followed the silence, the doubt, the unspoken question in everyone's eyes. How could a black teenager in a faded hoodie know anything worth listening to? He leaned his head against the window and stared into the night. Boston was still hours away. His Harvard med prep interview was the next morning, and he'd already rehearsed his answers in his head a dozen times. But something in him had shifted. That old, quiet part that always told him to keep his head down, blend in, stay safe. It had gone silent. Toward the front of the plane, Thomas Ellington sat upright, his hand still resting on Julia's arm. She'd stabilized. Her breathing was slow but steady. The oxygen mask was snug against her face, and her eyes had opened just long enough to squeeze his fingers once. But Thomas didn't look at her now. He was watching the boy in the back. He'd seen people jump into situations for attention. He'd seen overconfidence dressed as compassion. But this hadn't been that. This kid, Malik, if he'd heard correctly, hadn't even hesitated. He hadn't tried to prove anything. He'd acted, and he'd been right. The way he said pulmonary embolism had stuck in Thomas's mind, the way his voice didn't waver, and now, as the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, Thomas pulled out his phone, angled it through the aisle, and snapped a photo. He didn't know why. Maybe to remember, maybe to confirm later that this moment hadn't been imagined. The intercom buzzed overhead. The captain's voice came on, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a medical emergency, we'll be diverting to Halifax Stanfield International Airport. Estimated arrival in 23 minutes. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." A murmur moved through the cabin like wind through dry grass. People shifted in their seats, whispered. Thomas didn't speak. He glanced at the man who'd called for a doctor earlier, now studiously silent, eyes fixed on the screen in front of him. The flight attendants moved briskly, checking seatbelts, ensuring Julia's oxygen was secure. One of them leaned toward Thomas. "Sir, we'll have paramedics waiting, but I think she's out of danger for now. That boy, he might have saved her life." Thomas nodded, his gaze still locked on the boy in the hoodie. Malik saw the flicker of movement through the narrow gap between seats. He didn't react. He kept his head turned to the window, watching the black sky slowly fold into the lights of the approaching city. As the plane descended, the cabin lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the faces of strangers who'd been forced to witness something real, something fragile. Not everyone could process that. The wheels hit the tarmac with a thud, the sudden jolt pulling everyone forward, then back. Julia stirred. Her eyes fluttered again, and she gripped Thomas's wrist. "You're okay," he whispered, close to her ear. "We're on the ground. You're okay." Malik didn't turn around. He felt the plane slowing, the weight shifting beneath him. He glanced at the folded paper in his pocket, his itinerary, the time of his connecting flight, the hotel reservation for Boston, all of it blurred now. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Thomas stood slowly. He looked once more to the back of the plane, but by the time his eyes reached row 41, Malik was already on his feet, bags slung over one shoulder, eyes down, slipping into the shadows of the aisle like he'd never been there at all. Thomas hesitated. Then, almost without thinking, he stepped into the aisle and began walking toward the front, one hand still gripping the phone with the photo he wasn't sure why he'd taken. She didn't look back, but he knew. Something had changed. The hospital lights in Halifax Central were dimmer than they should have been. They gave everything a yellowed tinge, like old photographs you weren't ready to throw out but couldn't frame either. Thomas sat with his elbows on his knees, fingers laced tight. eyes fixed on the scratched tile floor. Down the hallway, muted voices drifted from the nurse's station, behind the double doors. Julia was being assessed, stabilized, monitored. But out here, time wasn't moving. He'd grown used to hospitals being quiet in a polished, expensive kind of way, private suites, hushed hallways, art on the walls that whispered wealth. This place wasn't like that. It was honest in its wear. Honest in the way the linoleum curled near the baseboards and the chairs wobbled when you leaned too far back. Honest in the way the boy stood against the far wall, hands in his pockets, not trying to be anywhere, but invisible. Thomas stood and walked toward him. Malik didn't shift or pretend not to notice. He looked up once, met Thomas's gaze, then dropped it again. "You with her?" Malik asked, voice flat but not unkind. "I'm her husband," Thomas said. Malik nodded. "She's strong. She'll be okay." Thomas studied the boy, up close. He looked even younger. Hoodie pulled tight, sneakers scuffed, a backpack slung low on one shoulder. There was a calm in him that didn't match his age. "You knew what to do," Thomas said. Malik shrugged. "I've seen it before. My grandma had the same thing last spring. The ER took hours. I started reading everything I could." "You study medicine?" "No. I read," Malik said again, this time with more edge. "I take care of her, learn what I can. People like us don't always get second chances." Thomas let the silence stretch. A part of him wanted to offer a thank you, or money, or some gesture of the world he came from. But this kid wasn't looking for a handout. He was holding something else, entirely principle. Maybe. Or pride. "I'm supposed to be in Boston tomorrow," Malik added, eyes still on the floor. "Harvard Med Prep. They do this early college thing. I got shortlisted. Interviews in the morning." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You fly alone?" "Yeah. Got a scholarship for the flight. My grandma scraped the rest together." He paused. "Looks like I missed it." Thomas opened his mouth, but a nurse appeared, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Ellington, your wife's stable. The baby's fine. They're both very lucky." Thomas nodded, mouth dry. The nurse moved on, her footsteps soft against the linoleum. He turned back to Malik, but the boy had already taken a step back, adjusting the strap on his bag. "You don't have to say it," Malik muttered. "Say whatever it is people like you say when you're uncomfortable being helped by someone like me." Thomas flinched, barely, but Malik softened. "Look, I didn't do it for thanks. I just couldn't sit there and watch it happen. That's all." There was a rawness in the way he said it, not defensive, not angry, just a tired kind of honesty that didn't ask for permission. Thomas reached for something in his pocket, hesitated, then drew out a business card. The weight of habit made him offer it out like he'd done 1,000 times before. Malik looked at it, but didn't move to take it. "I'm good," he said quietly. Thomas tucked the card back. "Then maybe I can do something else." Malik gave a half smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "You don't owe me anything." "That may be true," Thomas said, "but I still might owe your grandmother something." Malik finally looked up. His eyes weren't guarded now. They were searching. He turned, shoulders squared, walking toward the automatic doors at the end of the hallway. Thomas watched him go, watched the hoodie fade into the blur of people and light and cold air filtering in from outside. He didn't say thank you. He didn't ask his name again, but he'd already memorized it. The rain had started again. Not heavy, but just enough to tap against the long window of the hospital's family lounge. Thomas stood alone, his suit jacket folded over one arm, phone in his hand, but forgotten. The light above his head buzzed faintly, and beyond the glass, the parking lot glistened with slick pavement and stray reflections. Julia was resting now. Stable, they'd said. They wanted to monitor her overnight, but the worst was behind them. He hadn't told her about the boy yet. He sat down on a vinyl chair, legs stretched, phone screen waking under his thumb. He typed Malik Carter, Oakland. At first, there wasn't much 1 or 2 social media accounts that looked abandoned. A GoFundMe link long expired. A local news story from 3 years ago. He clicked. The image loaded slowly. A hallway bathed in fluorescent light. A boy in a blue hoodie standing beside an older woman seated in a wheelchair, smiling softly, her hands folded. The headline read, Oakland Teen Juggles School, Work, and Full-Time Care for Grandmother. Thomas stared at the photo. Malik looked younger, but the stillness in his eyes hadn't changed. The woman, Lorraine Carter, stirred something deeper. He leaned in. Berkeley, 22 years ago. The Ellingtons' estate had been enormous back then. It had echoed with the kind of cold money that never softened. His father ran the place like a business, meals at 7, inspections by 9, staff rotated with ruthless precision. Lorraine had lasted nearly 3 years. She wasn't like the others. She called Thomas sweet boy, hummed when folding his laundry, slipped him sugar cubes when his asthma kept him inside, until the day a silver bracelet disappeared from the master suite. No police, no questions, just a folded paycheck and a cab fare home. Thomas had cried, but his father had only said, "That's what happens when you trust too much." He thought about that now, the quiet erasure of someone who once mattered. He looked again at the photo. Malik's hand rested on Lorraine's shoulder in that shot. Not posed, not proud, protective. He put his phone down and leaned back, watching the ceiling. The boy didn't know. He probably never would. And something about that made Thomas uneasy. He'd spent decades building his empire, one silent deal at a time. Real estate, logistics, venture funds, no headlines, no scandals, just clean numbers, good optics. But in the stillness of that hospital lounge, Thomas saw a line that had never been audited, a line that stretched back to his own childhood and bent sharply into the present. Malik had saved Julia's life, had stepped forward when no one else did. Not for recognition, not even for thanks. And now Thomas was staring at a truth he hadn't asked for, layered into old family wrongs he'd learned not to question. He picked up the phone again, but didn't type. He thought about calling his mother. She would remember Lorraine. She'd probably know where the bracelet turned up too, but he didn't press her number. Some stories weren't ready for daylight. Outside, a taxi pulled up to the curb, lights glowing through the mist. Thomas stood, walked slowly down the corridor, past the nurse's station. He paused by Julia's door but didn't enter. She needed rest. He needed clarity. He passed the elevators, found a quiet corner, and leaned against the wall. Malik was gone. No one had seen him leave. But the name still lingered in Thomas's head like a song half remembered, not because of the boy's action, or the voice that had cut through doubt at 30,000 feet, because of the gap between the man Thomas had become and the woman his family once cast aside. He stayed there for a while, breathing in the antiseptic air, tracing the weight of history across a life that no longer seemed separate from his own. And when he finally moved, it wasn't with certainty, just with the sense that silence would no longer be enough. The morning came soft and gray. Outside the Fairmont Halifax, mist clung to the street lamps and curled around the corners of cars like it had nowhere else to go. Thomas sat by the window, buttoning his shirt without much interest, the collar still uneven. A silver tray of untouched breakfast rested on the table behind him. His coffee had long gone cold. Julia was asleep in the next room, her breathing steady. The doctors had cleared her for discharge by the following day. Still, Thomas hadn't let go of the feeling that had lodged itself just beneath his ribs. He'd watched her nearly die in front of him, and a stranger, a boy no one else had trusted, had kept her alive. He opened his laptop, the screen glowing too bright for his tired eyes. A blank email waited. He'd intended to send a message to someone on the Harvard Med Prep Board, something about the missed opportunity, something about Grace. But the cursor blinked, and the words didn't come. What did you write to explain that you were late because you saved a life, or that you weren't the one who did the saving? Meanwhile, just a few miles away, Malik sat on a cold metal bench at a city bus stop, bag tucked under his feet, hoodie drawn close. The ticket in his hand, printed on thin paper from a hospital computer, offered a series of stops: a ride across Canada, a transfer in Buffalo, and maybe, just maybe, a seat home. It didn't say anything about Boston. He checked his phone. No calls, no new messages. His grandma didn't have a cell, and the neighbor who watched her likely hadn't even noticed he'd missed the flight. A part of him wanted to laugh. Another part just wanted to sleep. The wet crunch of shoes on gravel broke his thought. Malik glanced up. It was Thomas. He didn't look like the man from the first-class seat anymore. No suit, no cufflinks, just a leather jacket, dark jeans, and shoes soaked from the walk. There was something in his face uncertain, but intentional. Thomas held out an envelope. He didn't explain it. He just waited. Malik took it slowly. Inside, a single ticket nonstop to Boston, first flight out, and folded with it, a letter bearing the logo of Halifax Central Hospital, signed by the attending physician, a referral, a commendation, a quiet truth on hospital letterhead. "You didn't have to," Malik said, eyes still on the paper. "I know," Thomas replied. The boy exhaled slowly. "I still might not make it in time." "I called," Thomas said. "They'll see you." "Noon today." Malik's grip on the envelope tightened. Thomas studied his face. "I didn't do this to pay you back." "Then why?" Malik asked. A moment passed before Thomas answered. "Because I should have said something yesterday. Because it matters that someone knows what you did. And because I have people who owe their lives to someone like you." Malik didn't answer right away. He looked off, toward the road, the thin streak of sun beginning to burn through the fog. After a while, he spoke again, softer. "Where I come from, people like my grandma, they don't get doctors. They get handed aspirin in plastic chairs. That's the only medicine they can afford." Thomas said nothing. Malik continued, voice low. "You don't have to fix that. But if you ever wonder what I really want, it's not scholarships. It's not praise. It's someone who will give her a name in a room where people usually don't ask." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's bigger than Harvard." "I know," Malik said, "but it's where I'd start." Thomas stepped back, letting the silence settle between them like something fragile but solid. Then he reached into his coat, handed Malik a business card, not the usual kind, not embossed or formal, just a number and a name. Thomas E. Ellington. No strings. Thomas said, "If you ever need a door opened, or just a name they won't forget." Malik stared at the card for a second. Then he put it in his pocket without a word. Thomas turned to go, the gravel crunching beneath him once more. The air smelled of damp leaves and city dust, and Malik sat there a little longer, the boarding pass curled slightly in his hand, wondering when the last time was that someone handed him a future without asking for something back. The Boston sky that evening was the color of wet slate, heavy with wind and the hush of snow that hadn't fallen yet. Malik stepped out of Logan Airport with a canvas backpack slung low and a cab receipt in his pocket he hadn't used. He chose the bus instead, sat near the back. Hoodie pulled tight, headphones in with no music playing. It was the silence that steadied him. The hotel was modest clean sheets, a flickering hallway light, a heater that clicked every 10 minutes. But he slept, not deep, not long, just enough. The next morning, he walked 2 blocks through frozen puddles to the interview site, a red brick building owned by Harvard Med Prep, tucked behind a quiet quadrangle. There was no banner, no formality. Just a woman at the front desk who handed him a badge and said, "Dr. Nguyen will be your lead evaluator. You'll meet with a panel." Malik nodded. "Thank you." Inside, the room was warmer than expected. Carpeted floors, a glass pitcher of water. 3 judges sat behind a table. 2 women, 1 man. One of them, the doctor from Halifax, gave a small, quiet nod when Malik entered. He sat straight, not stiff, just ready. They asked about his academic record, his volunteer work. He answered without trying to impress. When they asked why medicine, he paused for the first time. There wasn't a plan. Malik said, "It wasn't a calling. It was just necessity. My grandma got sick. I had to learn how to keep her alive. And somewhere in that process, I realized maybe I could do that for more than just her." The older woman leaned forward slightly. "That's touching, but we don't admit based on touching stories. You don't have clinical hours, no lab work, no recommendations from school faculty. Are you expecting this story to stand in for all that?" Malik looked at her, not angry, not defensive. "I'm not here to sell a story," he said. "I'm here because I've already done the work people usually don't see. I cleaned infections, measured blood pressure, sat through seizures. I didn't take notes for a grade. I took notes because if I got it wrong, she might die. So, no, I'm not expecting this to impress you. I'm just telling the truth." The room was still. The panelists exchanged glances. The Halifax doctor broke the silence. "Thank you, Malik. We'll be in touch soon." He stood, nodded once, and left the room. In the hallway beyond, a monitor showed a live feed of the room for observation purposes. Thomas stood off to the side, alone. No name tag, no clipboard, just watching. He hadn't planned to be there. But when the Halifax doctor had called and mentioned Malik's provisional interview, he'd asked if he could attend quietly, funded the logistics, didn't ask for a seat at the table, just wanted to see. What he saw was something he hadn't remembered in years, a younger version of himself. Not in the details Malik had come from another world entirely, but in the posture, in the way the boy hadn't tried to convince anyone he deserved a future. He'd simply refused to believe he didn't. That night, Malik got the call. Accepted into the summer cohort, early placement for students from underrepresented communities with exceptional resilience and medical aptitude. He hung up quietly, standing outside the same hotel in the dark. He didn't tell anyone, didn't celebrate. Instead, he booked a ticket home. On the ride back to Oakland, 13 hours by train, then 2 more on a local line, he kept his phone on his lap, watching the landscape shift from frost to concrete. Just before arriving, he sent a message. Not long, not emotional. "If you meant what you said, be at 48th Street Clinic, Friday, 2 o'clock. He didn't wait for a reply, just slipped the phone into his jacket and watched as his city came back into view. The 48th Street Clinic didn't look like a place where lives were saved. From the outside, it resembled a shuttered store paint flaking from the brick, windows fogged with years of breath and mildew. The sign above the door was hand-painted, one letter crooked. It didn't glow. It just hung there, as if staying up was its own kind of fight. Thomas pulled his coat tighter. The Oakland air had a quiet edge that morning, a dry chill that didn't ask for attention, but found its way through the seams. Malik met him at the entrance. No formalities, no handshake. "This way," he said. They walked side by side down a narrow hallway, where walls had been patched and repainted in uneven strokes. A nurse in pink scrubs passed them, carrying a box of bandages. She smiled at Malik, then blinked at Thomas like he didn't belong. She wasn't wrong. "This is Dr. Ramos," Malik said, nodding toward a small exam room. A woman with graying curls and clear eyes turned from a sink. "So you're the man who got us a working defibrillator." Her voice held no gratitude, just acknowledgement. Thomas gave a small nod. "It wasn't just me." She gave a soft, tight smile. "It never is." They continued past a waiting room with mismatched chairs and a bulletin board held together with pins and tape. Children sat on parents' laps. A cough echoed. Someone laughed too loud in a corner. There was life here, tired, hopeful, raw. Malik stopped at the end of the hall, outside a small room with a broken ceiling fan and a cracked exam table. "This is where my grandma was treated the first time," he said. Thomas stepped inside. The light flickered. On the wall, someone had taped up a poster about diabetes care in Spanish, its corners curling away like it wanted to leave. That night, Malik continued, she could barely breathe. I begged the nurse to send her to Kaiser, but she said without insurance. It'd be flagged. Said if I pushed, they'd discharge us entirely. Thomas's jaw tensed. So I called an Uber. Malik said. Got her there myself. Paid with rent money. Took a week to catch up. He didn't say it bitterly, just as fact. Thomas looked at the table, then at Malik. She made it. Yeah, Malik said. But just barely. There was a pause, wide enough to feel. You asked me to come here, Thomas said finally. What is it you want? Malik didn't answer right away. He walked over to a metal cabinet and opened it, revealing half-empty bottles of Tylenol, outdated asthma inhalers, and a folder marked referrals, pending. I don't want a new building, he said. I want this one fixed. Thomas frowned. I could fund a new facility, better equipment, more staff, branding that could pull real grants. Malik cut in, gently but firm. People won't follow you into a new place. They'll follow the ones who never left. Thomas studied him. Malik stepped closer. You want to help make this place stronger. Don't erase it. Don't rename it. Don't give it clean walls and forget who sat in these chairs. I didn't come here to own anything, Thomas said. Then prove it. Malik turned toward the hallway again. You can put your name on a plaque if you have to, but if you really want to mean something here, just fix the heater. Start with that. Thomas looked at the space again, at the peeling linoleum, at the space heater buzzing in the corner of the waiting room, at a mother rocking a child with a racking cough. He thought about the hospitals he'd funded in his otherworld white hallways, private donors, brushed aluminum signs with 6-digit names. This wasn't that. It was something else entirely, something that didn't need his name, just his willingness. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a CEO in a place full of needs. He felt like a man being asked, simply, not to disappear. The air in Oakland carried a different weight, that weak, not heavy, but charged. The kind of hum you feel before something begins, not ends. It started with a quiet press release, then a ripple. Then local cameras showed up with tripods and lights too bright for the cracked sidewalks they pointed at. The Ellington Foundation had announced a partnership with the city of Oakland and a group of unnamed local leaders to revitalize the 48th Street Clinic. They called it a grassroots-centered medical initiative. The headlines called it a redemption story. Malik didn't speak at any of the interviews. He showed up at dawn each day with a brush in hand, painted walls, hauled out old furniture, helped a retired electrician rewire the back rooms. He wasn't there for ribbon cuttings. He was there because someone had to be inside the clinic. The change was steady and real. New exam tables arrived in dented boxes. Volunteers refitted the waiting area with donated couches. A local artist painted a mural 2 hands passing a stethoscope to a child. They titled it, Knowledge Grows Here. In one of the first committee meetings with the Oakland Public Health Board, an older woman asked what seemed like a simple question. So the new name, Malik Health and Hope, where did that come from? Thomas, sitting quietly at the back in an open collar shirt, leaned forward. Because the people who laid the first brick, he said, usually don't put their names on the wall. The room went still. Someone scribbled in a notebook. Someone else just nodded. The day of the reopening wasn't flashy. No stage, no celebrity guest. But people came. Some brought flowers. Others just came to watch. The sun fell soft over the street that had never been marked on any real map, just 48th, between nothing and everything. Julia flew in from Los Angeles that morning. She wore flat shoes and a plain coat, no press trailing her. She walked slowly, still cautious from the complications weeks earlier, but her grip was firm when she reached for Malik's hand. Thank you, she said. Just that. They walked together to the front of the building, where a wheelchair had been rolled into place. Sitting in it was Lorraine Carter, wrapped in a shawl, a round pin on her lapel that read, Patient Saragoza 1. Malik knelt beside her and adjusted the blanket on her knees. You cold, Lorraine smiled with the same sharpness she'd had since he was a boy. I'm warm enough. You Malik didn't answer. He looked at the clinic, its new glass door, the line outside, the children laughing on the steps like they belonged there. When the moment came for remarks, Thomas stepped aside. Let the staff speak. Let the neighbors tell their stories. He clapped from the edge of the crowd, not in the spotlight. Then, as if on cue, a little boy with untied shoes tugged Malik's sleeve and handed him a folded piece of paper. Inside was a crayon drawing. Malik, arms outstretched, holding up a woman with silver hair. Behind them, a large white light filled the space where walls would have been. Malik blinked slowly. Julia leaned toward him. "Who's that behind you?" Malik didn't say. He turned the page once more. In the corner, written in jagged letters, "To the one who saved the ones who save." He folded the drawing carefully and looked across the crowd. Found Thomas. They didn't wave, didn't nod, but their eyes held. And that, for now, was enough. 1 week after the clinic's opening, the local public affairs program Faces of Change dedicated its Saturday segment to the story behind Malik Health and Hope. The set was modest, a brick backdrop, an oak desk, but the voice of the anchor carried weight. She recounted the moment aboard a British Airways flight, the teenager who stepped forward when no one else would, and the ripple effect that followed. The footage shifted to shots of the newly renovated clinic, children playing on the steps, nurses unpacking boxes, then Julia Ellington, smiling gently as she embraced Lorraine Carter under the soft gold of Oakland's afternoon sun. Behind them, the clinic's name shimmered on a new sign, not in gold, but in quiet dignity. Miles away. Inside the marble and glass conference room of Ellington Capital's downtown Los Angeles tower, Thomas sat at the far end of a long boardroom table. A screen on the wall played the broadcast as his executive assistant handed out printed transcripts. At first, no one paid much attention. Some scrolled on their phones. Others whispered notes about market projections. But when the screen displayed Malik's face, his hoodie exchanged for a clean shirt. His eyes still sharp and steady. Something shifted. Silence grew heavier than the concrete pillars surrounding them. An older man in a gray wool suit leaned forward. His name was Richard Halford, one of the firm's longest-serving board members. He spoke without looking up from the printout. Who is he, and why is the Ellington name attached to a community clinic in a zip code we've never invested in? The question floated, daring a response. A younger executive glanced at Thomas, then back to her notes. Thomas didn't move. He waited for the screen to shift again. It showed Julia laughing with a volunteer nurse, then Lorraine, holding a paper cup of tea, a patient badge still pinned to her cardigan. Finally, he looked up. His voice was calm but firm. "He's the boy who saved my wife's life, and my son's. That's who he is, and that's why our name is there." A rustle. The tension cracked but didn't vanish. Halford's mouth tightened. "This philanthropy, it's off-brand. These aren't markets. They're liabilities. We'll be dragged into policy talks, resource expectations, stories without profit margins." Another voice chimed in, sharper. "We're signaling risk, aligning the Ellington legacy with urban chaos. It's emotionally attractive, but unsustainable." Thomas stood. The action surprised them more than his words. "Then remove my name from the legacy, from the company, from your brochures and your marble plaque downstairs, but don't touch that clinic." No one replied. Some blinked. A few looked down. Thomas took the remote and turned off the screen. But the room still held the image of Malik, even in its silence. In the final seconds of the segment, back on television, the host asked her closing question. "Sometimes it's not about who we save, but who gets seen. What if a 17-year-old from Oakland has already changed what we believe about who deserves to be helped?" She paused, her expression quiet. "And if he has, are we brave enough to follow that night?" Malik sat alone in the quiet of his apartment. The walls still smelled faintly of old paint and bleach. On his phone, the messages piled in congratulations, requests for interviews, classmates from high school saying they'd always believed in him, but his thumb froze over a single message. Ellington. "His daddy helped shut down our hospital in '98. That's who you're standing next to." The words drained the room of its air. He dropped the phone beside him and sat back in the creaking chair. A single lamp lit the room, casting shadows across the floor like long arms reaching for something he couldn't see clearly. Malik opened his laptop. It wasn't hard to find. He knew how to look. Archived news articles, public budget reports. He filtered for years and narrowed dates. And there it was, in a forgotten city council summary, the acquisition of Oakland Central Medical by Crestland Ventures, under leadership of Thomas Ellington Sr. Within 18 months, the ER was shuttered. The building was gutted, redesigned, and rebranded as Heritage Lofts. Rent started at a price that locked out everyone who once used the hospital. No one from the neighborhood got hired for security or maintenance. The closest clinic was over 3 miles away. And Lorraine Carter, his grandmother, began walking those miles in the rain to refill her prescriptions. Malik leaned forward, head in his hands. The bile in his stomach rose slowly. This wasn't about a name on a building anymore. It was about a weight that had always pressed down on the people he loved and now somehow sat across the table from him, smiling, trying to shake his hand. He picked up his phone, not to text Thomas, but Julia. Her voice was quiet when she answered. Not surprised. He told you, didn't he? She asked. No, Malik said. But I found out. She sighed softly. He was a teenager when it happened. His father never let him near boardrooms. He only learned about it himself a few years ago. I think that's why Halifax shook him. He realized for the first time what his name had done. Malik was silent. Julia went on. He's not his father, Malik. He's trying to build something else. I see it. But the name's still his, Malik said, his voice low, careful. And it was that name that erased our place. It was your name that made my grandma walk 6 bus stops for insulin. There was a pause. Then Julia spoke slowly. Some things we inherit, but we choose what we carry forward and what we lay down. Malik stared at the wall. The shadows hadn't moved. He hung up without saying goodbye. For a long time, he sat still, breathing in the ache of contradiction. There was no betrayal, not yet, but there was a heaviness. Not anger, something quieter, a kind of mourning. Not just for what had happened in 1998, but for the thin, fragile line between help and harm and the names we don't get to choose. 2 days after the broadcast, just past 9 in the morning, Malik opened his apartment door to find Thomas standing there. No suit, no driver, just him in a faded gray sweater and sneakers that looked like they'd seen more sidewalks than carpets. Malik didn't say a word. He didn't move from the doorway. Thomas didn't expect to be let in. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, holding it out with both hands. These are the papers, he said. I'm transferring the deed of the old Oakland Central lot to the city. No conditions, no tax shelters, just giving it back. Malik's eyes dropped to the envelope, then back up. Why? The question wasn't soft, but it wasn't hostile either, just tired, like it had been asked too many times in too many ways. Thomas exhaled, steady. Because when I was 4, I used to sit on Lorraine Carter's lap. She'd hum while she stitched buttons back on my shirts. I ruined more thread than she had patience for, but she never raised her voice. And one day, she was gone. Nobody told me why, just gone. My father said nothing. Years later, I learned she was accused of stealing a silver bracelet that turned up in the garage 2 weeks after she'd been fired. Malik's jaw clenched. Thomas took a step back, not away, just giving space. I never forgot her hands, or the way she looked back at the house that day, like she knew she wasn't coming back, but hoped maybe someone would still remember she had been there. Malik looked at the envelope, then opened it. The paperwork was clear. Thomas had signed over full ownership. No legal games, no clauses, a full donation. The city would regain control of the land. Malik flipped to the last page there. In blue ink was the name Thomas W. Ellington. He closed the envelope gently, then looked up again. You know, I still don't trust the system you come from. I wouldn't expect you to, Thomas replied, but I also think trust can't be inherited. It has to be earned, just like guilt. Malik didn't reply at first. He studied the man in front of him, not the tailored figure from the airplane, not the name in glossy magazines, just someone older, weathered, trying. After a moment, Malik nodded once, not quite acceptance, but not rejection either. "I don't forgive easy," he said, "but I don't carry hate forever." Thomas's smile came slow and small, and for the first time, it didn't feel like something rehearsed. Malik stepped back not to invite him in, but just enough to let the air between them shift, just enough to make space for something that hadn't been there before. By the time the community health program entered its third month, the center's walls had been repainted twice, not because they were peeling, but because the neighborhood kids had asked to paint new murals. One side showed lungs made of tree branches, another, a heart shaped from linked hands. The name, Malik Health and Hope, was no longer just a sign above the door. It was a name people said out loud with clarity, not surprise. Inside the multi-purpose room, folding chairs lined the walls, tables stacked with bandages, blood pressure cuffs, and colored paper forms filled one end. This was not a lecture hall. It was a place of shared breath, of simple learning. Malik stood in front of a group of students, from second grade to high school. Thomas stood beside him, sleeves rolled up, demonstrating chest compressions on a practice dummy. He was awkward but attentive, pausing every few seconds to make sure he was doing it right, earning quiet chuckles and curious eyes. 2 inches deep, Malik reminded the kids. And don't stop unless someone more trained takes over, or you get too tired to continue. A 6-year-old girl raised her hand. Her pigtails were uneven, her voice unsure. "Mr. Malik, if my grandma can't breathe, what's the first thing I do?" Malik knelt in front of her, voice calm, but weighted. "First, sweetheart, you stay calm. You breathe for both of you. Then you listen. Really listen, because the body always says something before it gives up." The room went still. Even the older teens, usually half distracted, leaned in. From the back corner, a parent pressed their hand to their mouth, eyes glassy. Later, as the class wrapped, they handed out small cards. Emergency steps for home, printed with clear icons and bold numbers. Not many had phones. Even fewer had stable electricity. But they had these cards now laminated by a volunteer nurse who had grown up 4 blocks away. Thomas helped stack chairs. He wasn't teaching as much as he was learning how to step back, how to be useful without leading. He was almost out the side door when a boy, 10, maybe 11, called after him. "Mr. Ethan, are you coming back next week?" Thomas paused. He turned, smiled, and waved. He didn't say yes. He didn't have to. For the first time in years, the name people used for him, Ethan, not Mr. Ellington, felt real, felt earned. Rain had come quietly that morning, soaking Oakland's streets without warning. The gutters along 48th Street overflowed, and the paint on the sidewalk mural outside the clinic glistened, the heart-shaped hands now blurred at the edges. Inside, Malik Health and Hope. The rhythm of a Wednesday was unhurried, the sound of soft-soled shoes on tile, the beeping of a borrowed blood pressure monitor, the rustle of paperwork passed from one hand to another. Thomas arrived without calling ahead. He held a battered umbrella and a box labeled "Monitor, Donated." Water dripped from his coat sleeve as he set the box down. Malik noticed. Thomas never came on Wednesdays. That was Lorraine's dialysis day, and Thomas tended to avoid hovering. "Thought you might need a new unit," Thomas said simply, nodding toward the package. Malik nodded back, too focused on sorting intake forms to ask why the sudden gesture. He was about to respond when a small voice behind him piped up. "Daddy, look, that's him." They both turned. A little boy, barely 5, stood pointing at Thomas. His mother flushed red and crouched quickly to hush him. "I'm sorry. Mr. Ellington," she stammered. "He thinks you're his friend's dad. We've talked about you just stories. You know." Thomas raised a hand, his expression open, amused but quiet. "No harm done," he said gently. "Names get mixed up all the time." Malik didn't say anything, but the moment hung there, soft as a thread. A child had assigned Thomas a title, maybe by mistake, maybe not. Later, while lifting boxes of medication into the storage closet, the silence was interrupted again, this time from behind the clinic curtain. Lorraine, half reclined in a chair with a cuff on her arm, smiled faintly as the men passed by. "Call Ethan," she said, her voice raspy but clear. "Walks like my father used to back when he still loved someone but hadn't found the nerve to say so." Malik froze. He'd never heard that name. Ethan. He turned to glance at Thomas. The man was crouched, adjusting a tangled IV line, not reacting, not flinching, just quiet. After a long pause, Lorraine added, "I remember names that were never allowed to live. When the rain thickened in the late afternoon and patients began to thin out. Thomas readied to leave. Malik walked him out. Umbrella open above them, shoes splashing in shallow puddles. As they reached the front gate, Malik spoke without turning. Ethan Thomas stopped. He nodded once. "My given name. My mother chose it. My father erased it from every record by the time I turned 5. Malik watched a bus crawl past on the wet road. He didn't speak right away. Then he said, 'Maybe it's time to use it again.'" Thomas looked at him, eyes uncertain. I wouldn't know where to begin. Malik gave a small shrug, lips hinting at a smile. "Maybe start in the one place where people already say it, whether you acknowledge it or not." The day the article dropped, the center was midway through its weekly nutrition seminar. Parents sat in folding chairs beside their children, all watching a young nurse demonstrate how to read sugar content on cereal boxes. Malik stood near the whiteboard, gesturing to a chart on meal planning, unaware that his name had just landed on the front page of the New York Times beneath a headline that read, "From Empire to Empathy, the Fall and Rise of an Ellington." At the bottom of the screen in a waiting room television, a ticker scrolled Thomas Ellington steps away from executive board amid controversy. Julia saw it first while helping Lorraine adjust the bandage on her forearm. Lorraine glanced over, her eyes narrowing. Julia didn't speak. Instead, she looked across the hallway to where Malik was kneeling beside a girl in a yellow dress, showing her how to wash between her fingers. Hours later, in a marble-paneled boardroom high above Midtown Manhattan, Thomas stood facing men he once called partners. Their suits were sharper than their words, but their message was clear. One man, older, leaned forward. "Your alignment with this project has stirred concern. The press is reframing your legacy." Another chimed in, less diplomatic. "The Ellington name is not a nonprofit." And so, the vote was passed. Temporary removal, strategic distancing. The official press release read, "Mr. Thomas Ellington is pursuing community-focused ventures outside the purview of Ellington Capital. He no longer speaks on behalf of the firm's investment strategy." By the time the story was trending, Thomas was already on a flight back to Oakland. He arrived after dark. The center lights were still on, the building quiet but alive. He didn't greet anyone, didn't pause to speak. Instead, he walked straight to the small office tucked behind the exam rooms, the one with the leaky faucet and the old green chair Lorraine insisted was lucky. He sat, opened his laptop, and began to type. Malik found him there half an hour later. The glow from the screen reflected in Thomas's glasses. Papers were spread across the desk, handwritten notes, schematics, architectural renderings of the expansion. Thomas didn't look up. "They made you choose," Malik asked from the doorway. Thomas's fingers paused on the keyboard. "They told me I could have the company, or I could have the name I want to live as." Silence settled like dust. Malik stepped inside, closed the door softly behind him, and he asked. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He reached forward, closed the laptop, then stood. His voice was quieter than usual, but steady. "I didn't choose," he said. "I'm rebuilding." Malik looked at him for a long moment. There were no grand declarations, no public denouncements, just one man in a frayed sweater, eyes a little tired, hands no longer made for deals, but perhaps finally made for holding something real. It was a Saturday that felt like spring forgot to leave. The scent of grilled corn and old bricks mixed in the air around the 48th Street block. Kids darted between booths holding balloon animals. An elder drummer beat out a rhythm by the fountain. Malik Health and Hope's first community day had begun. At the heart of it all stood a painted wall, new, bright, imperfect. A mural drawn by local students, two men standing back to back, framed by the crooked rooftops of East Oakland. One man wore a white coat, the other, a faded suit and soft eyes. Scrawled across the top, in thick orange letters, were words that didn't sound like a quote, but like something someone's grandmother might have whispered, "You don't have to fix the world. Just don't let it break where you stand." Thomas sat off to the side beneath a canopy tent, a smudge of blue paint drying on his sleeve. He was wearing a red apron now, courtesy of Julia and her volunteer fashion rule. A small boy had just spilled juice on his lap. Lorraine, in her wheelchair, was beside him. She waved off an offer of water. "No thanks. I'm saving room for another ice cream." He laughed, nodded toward the cart. "I'll make it happen." Across the square, Malik checked a clipboard and watched a nurse take a blood pressure reading beside a taco stand. Music from a student jazz quartet drifted over the noise. Then someone called for a pause. A girl barely 10 handed Malik a microphone and gestured toward the stage. There wasn't much of a setup. No spotlights, no big names, no sponsors to thank. Just a speaker stand propped between a folding table and a few flower pots. But people started to gather anyway. He stepped up without hesitation. No paper in his hand. Just his voice. "I grew up thinking people like me don't get to stand on things," he said. "Not stages, not ground that isn't cracked. Definitely not places with names on walls." There were a few chuckles, mostly quiet. I didn't think I'd get to help anyone. I just wanted to stop seeing my grandmother wait in lines to be told she didn't qualify, or that her pain wasn't urgent, or that her life wasn't enough paperwork to be treated. His eyes didn't blink when they turned toward Thomas. And then I met someone who came from everything I thought I had to fight against. And he showed up anyway. Not because someone told him to, but because he remembered being held on the shoulders of a woman who was once invisible here. He let the silence stretch. The wind shuffled a poster. A child sneezed. "I'm not here to make speeches, but I want to say this. The richest man I've met wasn't the one who built empires. It was the one who kept his promise when nobody asked him to." The clapping began soft, then grew. Julia reached for Lorraine's hand. One of the musicians dabbed at their eyes with a sleeve. But Thomas didn't move, didn't wave, didn't even raise his head. He just sat still, hands folded on his knees. As if for the first time in years, being seen didn't matter anymore. He knew he didn't need to be applauded. He just needed to belong. 6 months later, autumn had laid its golden hand across Oakland. The trees lining 48th Street whispered in copper and ochre, and the wind was soft enough to keep jackets zipped, but hearts open. That afternoon, Malik Health and Hope opened its new maternity wing. A simple sign out front read, "Today we begin again." Lorraine sat beneath a red maple, scarf tucked around her neck, her hand resting gently on the folded intake form. She looked thinner than before, but her eyes held the same dry mischief. A nurse helped her from the wheelchair. "First appointment in the new wing," the nurse said with a wink. Lorraine just shrugged. Someone's got to make sure it works. Inside, the hum of small voices filled the air. In the playroom, preschoolers clomped around in felt stethoscopes and tiny cloth lab coats. One girl with 2 braids tugged the sleeve of a passing nurse. "Where's Mr. Malik?" The nurse chuckled. "Busy. He's helping make something." Out in the yard, near the community garden beds, a group of local artists worked slowly, precisely. At the center of their effort was a sculpture just a few feet high, 2 open hands cast in bronze, cupping a pair of small child's shoes. It wasn't flashy, it didn't shout, but people paused when they passed it. On the base, words had been etched in soft, unvarnished script. God put knowledge in the hands of those who chose to use it. Malik stood near the edge of the group, arms crossed. He wasn't giving instructions, just watching, as if letting the moment assemble itself. A few yards away, near the corner where the garden met the fence, a man adjusted the hinges on a gate. He wore a navy apron smeared with paint and sawdust. His cap was pulled low, shoulders slightly hunched as he knelt to tighten a bolt. It was Thomas. He hadn't spoken on the mic, hadn't posed for the donor photo, hadn't even parked in the usual lot. He simply came in through the side alley, toolbox in hand, and began fixing a loose latch that no one had mentioned aloud, but everyone had noticed. Someone from the local paper asked Malik later, why didn't he take the stage today? Malik didn't answer right away. He just looked toward that far corner, where Thomas stood, wiping his hands on a rag, smiling faintly as he watched a group of children chase a soccer ball across the grass. He didn't need to, Malik said eventually. Some people say everything by staying. Lorraine came out of the maternity wing last, pushing her own chair. She paused by the sculpture, tilted her head, and smiled without a word. And in that quiet, with leaves brushing the sidewalk and laughter carried on the breeze, the man in the far corner stayed where he was, not claiming space, not asking for thanks, just making sure things held together. The statue wasn't grand, just two hands, weathered and strong, holding a child's shoes. But some mornings, when the fog rolled low over Oakland, it looked like they were still warm. People walked by, coffee in hand, phone to ear yet now and then. One would pause, not for the name, for the quiet behind it. Maybe the most lasting legacies aren't shouted, but lived. And maybe some promises don't need to be made aloud to be kept, especially when someone keeps showing up, long after the applause is gone.